A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. We are now prepared to destroy more rapidly and completely every productive enterprise the Japanese have in any city.
During the time of US occupation in Japan between 1945 and 1952, any negative mention of the United States, including the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was censored. Because of this, the collective consciousness of the Japanese people was unable to directly deal with the trauma that came from the use of nuclear weapons. Likewise, after the occupation, Japan became dependent on the US for trade. Thus, Japanese media was only able to tangentially reference the devastation it had faced. These circumstances are what gave birth to the kaiju genre, and of course, Godzilla. We now live many decades removed from the horror that was the Second World War. And with that time has come the freedom to interpret the events more openly, which we see in modern Japanese media. Looking into the history, the original Godzilla 1954 film was released just 2 years after the end of US occupation in Japan. To avoid any censors, the movie appears to take place in a very similar world to our own, with no Second World War having occurred. There is no mention of the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. In fact, throughout the whole film, there are no nuclear explosions to be seen, and only weapons tests in the Pacific are ever mentioned, which of course are why Godzilla emerges from the deep ocean. Something interesting written by Matthew Edwards I want to point out is, quote, "Japan's failure to see this as an atrocity or war crime can be attributed to the blanket censorship imposed by the occupying forces on the arts and media, the result of which meant that any discussion of the bombings were strictly forbidden, for fear, as Richie points out, that it would serve as useful propaganda in stoking anger towards their occupiers." End quote. Simply put, at the time of its creation, a movie like Godzilla was as close as the media could get to representing the pain and suffering the Japanese people felt from being repeatedly bombed by the United States. Godzilla is a major pioneer in the film industry and gave rise to one of my favorite kaiju fighting genres, the mecha. But this is for a very important reason. In a lot of ways, Godzilla is effectively a stand-in for a nuclear explosion. He is a reimagining in the form of a large, physical monster, and unlike an explosion, a giant lizard is something you can tangibly fight. Granted, he does have nuclear fire breath and is fucking huge, but you can fight him, and you can win. As mentioned by Shannon Stevens, quote, "The importance of recognizing the emotional and psychological ramifications of trauma in leading a healthy and productive life helped make it clear why the emotionality of Gojira was so important for the Japanese, many of whom left theaters in tears after seeing the film for the first time." End quote. However, it's also important to point out the fact that this film puts aside the atrocities performed by the Japanese during the war. Japan, throughout this film, is largely depicted as a victim of a natural disaster brought about by the Americans testing nuclear weapons in the Bikini Atolls. Japan's military throughout the film is also depicted as just a heroic force for good, which is only deployed purely to defend the country. Likewise, the characters that create a bomb to kill Godzilla aren't investigated, and their backgrounds are obscured, only vaguely referenced at all. It's entirely possible that due to the censorship enacted by the United States during the occupation, much of the Japanese media avoided trying to confront the horrific experiments performed during wartime. However, this lack of acknowledgement also prevented the country from being able to confront its past in order to avoid such actions in the future. Nowadays in the 2000s, after a lifetime of restrictions being lifted, popular Japanese culture is now able to openly reference these events throughout their media. Critically acclaimed movies and shows like Your Name, Redline, Evangelion, Attack on Titan, Alice in Borderland, and even the modern Godzilla -1 now properly reference nuclear weapons. And major live-action media like the previously mentioned Godzilla -1 now openly reference the Second World War, though acknowledgements of Japan's wrongdoings in that war are still nowhere to be seen in the mainstream. A quote I want to point out by Dr. Kwan, quote, "Anger towards the United States was confined within the private realm and quickly disappeared from public discourse. This is likely related to the ironic fact that Japan enjoyed economic prosperity and peace under the US nuclear umbrella. Pursuing the United States' responsibility for the atomic bombing would entail recognition of the origin of the war, which might invite greater attention to Japanese war responsibilities. If one holds the United States, which claims that the atomic bombing was done to end the war early, accountable, one inevitably will be asked about Japan's responsibility for its colonial rule." End quote. After all, it's preferable to only be remembered for the cool stuff in the media you make and not the horrific actions you took. But that path is a double-edged sword. Not confronting the atrocities you committed and not owning up to them also means you can't openly acknowledge what others did to you. Ultimately, the PTSD of being nuked twice doesn't just disappear. If suppressed, it can leave mental scarring. This can and does last generations and could likely remain in folklore for millennia with the help of stories like that of Godzilla. The original movie explores what happens when humanity plays God and wakes true deities from their slumber. The destruction left by Godzilla in its wake is the net result. These are a people that are still trying to make sense of the fact that these offensive strikes of mass destruction were not a natural disaster. They were a choice. I have been Kevin Gustavo Roldan. Hasta la próxima.